All right, so I'd just like to invite a speaker for today, who is Dr. Bonnie Etherington, and she's from Environmental Futures. Bonnie is going to tell us about her work with Indigenous poetic protests and US militarization. So the Zoom stage is all yours, Bonnie. Take it away.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this talk today. And especially, I know when you're all probably zoomed out already. I want to take the time to first acknowledge the lands that I am and CU Boulder is on right now, and that these are Arapaho, Ute, Cheyenne, and Eastern Shoshone lands. So I'm going to talk for about 35, 40 minutes today, and then there'll be time for questions. And I'll be talking on research arising from my dissertation. I'm from a literature background, so I know a lot of people who speak at this postdoc series are from science backgrounds, but I'm excited to share the literary side of these things with you. So I will share my screen now. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, okay, cool. So in 2019, two stories circulating online caught my attention. And the first was, believe it or not, about SpongeBob. Holly Barker, a professor of anthropology at the University of Washington, published an article about US nuclear testing in Bikini Atoll as the real oceanic context for TV show SpongeBob SquarePants Bikini Bottom. This article drew media attention when Barker started receiving death threats and was the target of other online vitriol for the article. In 1946, the US removed Bikinians from the island in order to test nuclear weapons. This removal was supposed to be temporary, but Bikinians still can't return because radiation levels are too high. Not to mention they and other Marshallese peoples, especially those from the neighboring atolls of Rongelap and Eniwetak, still suffer effects of radiation today. And on the screen there, I have a picture of Bikini Atoll today at the bottom. Then I have the Marshall Islands, so you can see how some of the many islands that make up the Marshall Islands. And then on the left-hand side is Marshall Islands contextualized within other island groups in Oceania, or what is also known as the Pacific Islands. Holly Barker's article about SpongeBob delineates how narratives told about the Pacific through popular culture, like SpongeBob, can erase Pacific history. In this case, as she puts it, quote, the show's creation of a fictional world in the non-fictional homelands of the Bikinians removes the US history of violence on that atoll and the Marshallese people from our gaze, end quote. The way media characterized her article and the subsequent online backlash against her forced her to release a statement in defense of her research. And there at the bottom, she asserts that she's not specifically calling SpongeBob a racist character. She's saying that the show itself is participating in wider narratives that facilitate US occupation and destruction in the Marshall Islands. So around about the same time, another story also involving the Bikini Atoll and nuclear testing was unfolding. The US-based Manhattan Project Beer Company flatly refused to change the name of their Bikini Atoll beer after an online campaign for them to do so. So if you look at their website, you can see other nuclear named beers such as Nuclear Winter and Necessary Evil. And what does the nuclear bomb have to do with beer? Not entirely sure. And the website never makes that quite clear. And of course, naming a company the Manhattan Project skips over the fact that the US mined uranium for the Manhattan Project nuclear tests from Laguna Pueblo lands in New Mexico, co-opting and contaminating their lands. However, the Bikini Atoll beer is the only one named after a specific place that has been decimated by nuclear testing. You can see that they also cartographically represent the atoll in the beer's marketing image. So this image I have on the screen now is from their blog post that talks about inspo for the beer. The Marshall Islands government heard about the beer and waded into the conflict to officially ask them to cease and desist, but the company would not budge. The company released a defensive statement that argued that they were bringing awareness to Bikini Islanders, even though none of their marketing contained anything about the history of the atoll, and of course, none of the profits were benefiting any Marshallese people. So not only did they refuse to change the name of their Bikini Atoll beer, but they expanded it, selling it in two flavors over the summer, which was raspberry and coconut key lime. So both of these examples show that many Americans remain completely unaware of the US's devastating nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands Bikini Atoll, but their ignorance is no accident. Of course, most non-Bikinians probably associate the term bikini with the swimsuit, as E. Kiribati scholar Teresia Tewa has pointed out. SpongeBob and the swimsuit have both successfully changed the narrative of the islands from one of nuclear devastation and exploitation to cultural icons that do not include Indigenous peoples at all. Worse though, the two incidents I described suggest that raising awareness about the history and present circumstances of Bikini is not enough. Once made aware of this history, an avalanche of online social media users attacked Barker over SpongeBob, and fans of the beer company flatly said that they did not care, specifically that they did not feel like their lives were connected to such violence and it wasn't relevant to them. Tewa writes that the erasure of Bikini history through tropical paradise narratives conveyed via images like the swimsuit and SpongeBob are deliberate, strategic forms of national forgetting that facilitate the entrenchment of US militarization in the Pacific. While the people of Bikini still cannot return home to their devastated land and waters, US companies have long histories of profiting off images of island paradise like the one on your screen. We can also look to representations of islands such as Hawaii that are directly tied to the ways in which tourist developments have brought up so much of their land, pushing people out, erasing or tokenizing native presences, and making life unaffordable on their lands as they're also hit by increasingly extreme natural disasters. And to just bring it to our current moment, in the case of COVID, for example, I've seen multiple articles framing Hawaii as, and social media posts framing Hawaii as this place to escape the pandemic from, without thinking about the people there at all. As scholars of militarism and tourism in the Pacific, such as Tewa and Bernadette Gonzalez have shown, paradise itself is, quote, and this is a quote from Gonzalez, paradise is not a generic or static term, but rather is conjured up through imaginative labor sustained by such economic apparatuses as plantation and tourism industries, and the hierarchical societies that they engender, secured through the threat and reality of violence or the promise of rescue, and continually contested by the people who live there, end quote. Gonzalez's breakdown of paradise effectively demarcates how its construction lies at the intersections of narrative, material, and embodied processes. She shows how imperial and capitalist representations of oceans and their islands encode particular perspectives of and attitudes about them, enabling actions with very real repercussions. Once such hegemonic narratives deem the islands contaminated or exhausted, they depict them as no longer useful, ignore the islands, and dispense of them. There are numerous examples of this in the Pacific, but another one that immediately comes to mind is the case of Kiribati, where Australian, British, and New Zealand governments extensively mined the islands for phosphorus, displaced entire communities, and then abandoned them. So the ways that colonial powers, including the US, map and describe Pacific Island locations therefore have enormous environmental, social, and political effects on Oceania's populations and communities, including non-human ones. And representations of islands as small, empty, and isolated, and as places to be explored or used as research sites, are directly linked to the ways they have been exploited by colonialism, exacerbating the destruction of their lands and contamination of their waters, and contributing to how world governments ignore Indigenous peoples and their calls for political recognition, demilitarization, and urgent climate action. As scholar of the Pacific, Elizabeth Delary demarcates in her article, The Myth of Isolates, narratives of islands not just as paradises, but as laboratory-like spaces directly enable the US, France, and Britain to conduct nuclear experiments in the Pacific, like the one in Bikini from 1946 to 1996. And it's led to ongoing displacement and health effects for Indigenous peoples, not just in the Marshall Islands, but also in places such as French Polynesia, Guam or Guahan, and Christmas Island, also known as Kiriti Mas. So my wider dissertation which is now a book project, hopefully, working on it. One Saltwater, Writing the Pacific Ocean in Contemporary Indigenous Protest Literatures, is therefore invested in the ways that novels and poetry by Indigenous authors intervene in US and Eurocentric discourses of the Pacific. So these are some of the books that I look at in my research. So I examine works by authors from French Polynesia, Samoa, Guam, Hawaii, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, the Pacific Northwest, and West Papua. And we're very lucky today that one of the authors is on this Zoom call, and he will also be the author I am talking about in the second half of this talk. So I'll talk more about that later, but I'll just plant that seed now. So this gives you a picture again of the diversity of Oceania. But these literatures, though very diverse, are linked by their focus on the Pacific Ocean and by their portrayal of the ocean as a place that is central to their homelands and histories, providing avenues for Indigenous collaborations that stand against oppression, not just locally, but also globally. And my research shows how these authors represent the Pacific as a place defined by Indigenous peoples and their relationships with each other. And these representations in turn gesture towards possible futures for Indigenous peoples in the face of political, cultural, and environmental exploitation. So reading these writers together shows that their literatures are not only responses to colonialism, but part of creating Indigenous coalitions of ocean-centered activism that privilege Indigenous narratives in transnational networks of the Pacific, rather than sidelining them, erasing them, or just seeing them as a nice addition, thus central. So before I do move on to discussing some spam poems that feed into these themes, I want to articulate a bit about my own positionality when coming to this research. I come to this project because of my experiences as a non-Indigenous New Zealander of European descent who grew up in West Papua, where I saw how art and creative expressions are central to the work of decolonial activism. In this case, as Papuans work to free themselves from Indonesian occupation. And that red marker there is where I grew up, in a place called Korbakma. So very quickly, the western side of the island New Guinea was colonized by the Dutch and was annexed by Indonesia in 1963. Long story short, the Kennedy administration wanted Indonesia to support their anti-communist efforts in Southeast Asia, so they turned a blind eye to the annexation, and then the UN followed. So ever since then, Papuans have been fighting for their freedom. It's a much more complex story than that, but that's the gist of it. On the slide here, I have a work of poetry written by Indigenous authors from across the Oceania in support for West Papua. And on the other side, a Papuan activist from the Free West Papua movement. And this is images from protests that were just last year against racism that many Papuans experience in Indonesia and against colonization. So in Papua, I saw that the role of stories was clear for passing on knowledge as a form of resistance, but I also saw how narratives can oppress. I saw how Indonesian narratives frame Papuans as isolated, poor, uneducated, and not modern. And I saw how these narratives facilitated government oppression against Papuans, including justifying violent military crackdowns on peaceful protests, confiscating their lands, and excluding Papuans from many opportunities to fulfill their basic needs. After leaving Papua for my undergraduate studies in New Zealand, I noticed that the media either ignored Papua completely or also represented the country through partial limiting narratives. So in an effort to push back against these narratives, to illustrate New Zealand, Australian, and US complicity in Papua's colonization, as well as trying to highlight continuing stories of Papuan resistance, I wrote a novel. At the time, it seemed like the way I felt best equipped to be some kind of witness and grapple with Papua's complex layers of colonization and exploitation. And my scholarly research is another way of trying to do this work of highlighting decolonial literary activism in the Pacific. So I point these things out to say that essentially I'm coming to my work here through both frameworks of creative writing and literary analysis. The authors I research essentially challenge stories about the ocean and them in it, and are telling their own stories in different protest contexts. So today I'm going to talk, in the second half of this talk, I'm talking in more detail about the ways one of these writer activists, Craig Santos Perez, grapples with US narratives and strategic forgetting of the Pacific and of Guam in particular. And to do that, first I'm going to talk to you a bit about spam, the food product, not the textual product. Specifically the pink meat product packed in distinctive rectangular cases that are recognized worldwide. So here's first some context for spam in the Pacific. Most children who grow up on an island in the Pacific have a spam story or a specific way that their family eats spam. In the lower central highlands of West Papua, where peanuts are the main export and one can still find US bullets left over from World War II, my mother cubed spam and fried it with soy sauce and those peanuts. We ate it over rice. One Christmas, missing ham from our passport country of New Zealand, Mum served us thickly sliced spam, fried, again, obviously, alongside mashed potatoes and the dehydrated peas that she'd made us squeeze in our suitcases. A quick web search for spam, the food product, reveals articles about its status as a luxury item in South Korea, an obesity crisis blamed in part on spam in Samoa, ongoing curiosity and suspicion about its ingredients, essays about spam shame in the US, horrific factory conditions affecting mainly immigrant workers, reports of a spam black market in Hawaii, and news that a pumpkin spice spam will be released last fall, and it was, and so on. And this is probably my favorite one. It's a topographical map of Hawaii made from spam, and a simply horrendous article by National Geographic, which frames spam as some kind of white savior for Native Hawaiians. So food scholar Robert G. Sonku writes of spam's dubious reputation in the US and reminds readers that, quote, while it exists mainly as an object of snooty condescension and a symbol of culinary and unsophistication in most parts of the United States, the product is held in much higher regard elsewhere in the world, end quote. As he points out, American white upper and middle classes often racialize and reject spam because of its so-called dubious qualities, completely disregarding how spam came to be taken up in so many different cuisines. Spam is now perhaps one of the world's most recognizable trademarks, like McDonald's, and as such has the power to inspire a vast spectrum of emotions, from nostalgia to shame, passion, love, desire, loathing, and disgust. I, for one, am torn between love and shame. If you drive the 6 hours from Chicago to Austin, Minnesota, where spam began in the Hormel factory, you'll find the Spam Museum. And you might make your husband drive all the way there and back in one day, which takes 12 hours, but is very interesting. This museum proudly shows off spam's many different variations in the US and right across the Pacific. A sign proclaims that from the beginning, spam products were a part of cultures and cuisines and now enjoyed in more than 40 countries. Because Hormel's legacy began with canned meats for Depression-era government programs, before the company moved into creating military rations during World War II, not only for US troops, but for US allies, there is a distinctively patriotic bent to spam's advertising and the way its narrative is curated in this museum. So here are just some examples. These are mainly ones about feeding the troops and feeding our allies. So literally spam is narrated as being part of the war effort itself. Another example of that, spam lends a hand, is personified as literally lending a hand. I really like this picture. It's the mascot of spam during World War II, Slam and Spammy. So spam becomes a pig, which becomes a Marine. It's a complex story. Again, the reiteration about patriotism. And then there's a just fun one where you can see how many cans of spam high are you, which for me is not very much, but you know, it was fun. So there's all these children's things in the museum alongside these patriotic narratives, which is quite fascinating. So despite being ridiculed in many ways within the US, the history of spam then has entangled itself within the US nation-state project, and since at least 1944 has been aligned with the US Pacific Imperial Project. Spam's military entanglements are why so many people from the Pacific have a spam story. But these spam stories have particularly imperialist manifestations for Indigenous peoples in the US and in US Pacific territories, where the military has left its legacies or continues to maintain its presence. So standing in stark contrast to the narratives told by the Spam Museum and engaging with the spectrum of global emotions and frequently ironic gastropolitics that underpin Spam's roots in the Pacific are the poems of Craig Santos Perez, an Indigenous Chamorro poet from Guam. In 2013, Perez wrote a poetic blog entry for the Kenyan Review entitled, "I Eat, Therefore I Spam." In it, he describes how his homeland of Guam became a territory of the United States following the Spanish-American War, and then how the US reoccupied it from the Japanese during World War II. He shows that Spam's history in Guam coincides with and is entangled with the US reoccupation, writing, quote, "After America bombed and invaded war-torn Guam in 1944, Spam arrived. My grandmother was a young woman at that time. She described her first taste of Spam as manna from heaven. Thereafter, Uncle Sam became Uncle Spam." Perez later recycled parts of this entry into his Spam poems in his 2014 and 2017 books, Guma and Lukau, which are the third and fourth books in his From Unincorporated Territory series, and you can see the 4 books here. In these poems, Perez reveals Spam's roots in the Pacific as inseparable from military buildup and its accompanying ecological devastation throughout Oceania, and in Guam in particular, or to use its Indigenous Chamorro name, Guahan. Spanish, Japanese, and US military forces have long portrayed and used Guahan as a site for expanding and maintaining their empires in the Pacific. Perez's From Unincorporated Territory series as a whole documents this history and these complex strands of multiple militarisms from a Chamorro-centered perspective. Since reclaiming Guam from the Japanese after World War II, the US continues to use the island as a critical part of their military strategy in the Pacific. And you can see from this map how much land the US military occupies. But this doesn't show also how much of its waters it occupies as well. The US military occupies at least a third of the Guam's land for its use, and even more in islands in the Northern Marianas, and not to mention the water space it takes up contaminates or restricts from Chamorro use. After decades of such occupation, 90% of Guam's food is imported, even though, as Lisa Linda, Natividad, and Gwen Kirk point out, the island was self-sufficient before World War II. The unincorporation in Perez's book titles refers to a 1901 ruling that established, quote, that the United States can hold a territory as a colonial possession without ever incorporating the territory into the United States or granting sovereignty to that territory, end quote. The US granted citizenship to the people of Guam in 1950, just in time, as Perez points out, for its youth to be drafted into the Korean War. However, as an unincorporated territory, these citizens still do not have rights of political representation. And a scholar here at CU Boulder, Tiara Naputi, she's an assistant professor in communication, has recently written some very great op-eds about this very subject. So I highly recommend. Additionally, Guam's pivotal role for the US's Pacific strategy is often invisible, literally a blank space on some maps. But countering this invisibility, Perez's poetry remaps the Pacific to show the layers of US militarism in Guam and beyond, advocating for demilitarization by showing that the linked traumas of land dispossession and environmental damage are transnational and transoceanic phenomena. At the same time, what I call Perez's gastropoetics of Spam also foregrounds Chamorro resistance in the face of militarization and their intimate links to the persistence of Indigenous peoples affected by US empire right across the Pacific. So I'm now going to read one of these Spam poems for you, and you can see it on the slide, and use it to illustrate how Perez is using Spam in this poem and others to make visible the US's vast trans-Pacific military reach and impact. So this poem is from the third book in his series, Guma, and titled, like all the Spam poems in this book, Jinen, The Legends of Juan Malo, a Malo log. It was a theory of mine that former cannibals of Oceania now feasted on spam because spam came the nearest to approximating the porky taste of human flesh. It was a fact that the people eaters of the Pacific had all evolved or perhaps degenerated into spam eaters. And that quote is from Paul Thoreau, The Happy Isles of Oceania. Guam is considered the spam capital of the world. On average, each Chamorro consumes 16 tons of spam each year, which is more per capita than any other country. Headline, Guam struggles to find its roots from beneath spam's carbon footprint. Do all 7 McDonald's restaurants on Guam feature spam on the menu? Welcome to Guam. Let us present you with the gourmet luxury of spam at your birthday, wedding, and funeral. A culinary legacy of American troops stationed in the Pacific during World War II, spam is also popular in Hawaii, the Philippines, Okinawa, and South Korea, and all places with a history of US military presence. In fact, spam may have been responsible for Hitler's defeat. The Allies would have starved without spam. Plus, it's processed, so I guess we can save it for the coming war between the US and China, right? Wow, I haven't seen this much spam since I lived on Guam, and the car dealership there started offering a 50-pound bag of imported white rice and a case of spam with every car purchase. In the devastating wake of Typhoon Omar, Hormel donated 40,000 cases of spam to the Salvation Army's disaster relief effort. The end result of so much spam can be found in our newspaper's obituary pages. Strikes me now that I could have asked Craig to read it for me, but don't want to make you do too much work. So there's a lot to discuss here, but I am going to stick to some main points. Perez's spam and other processed meat poems that focus on, incidentally, corned beef hash and Vienna sausage all fall under the heading you see in this poem. As Perez explains in the notes for this book, Juan Malo is a trickster figure in Chamorro stories, a young, poor Chamorro man who makes mischief to frustrate Spanish colonial officials. He also points out that Malo means bad in Spanish, a last name given to Juan to suggest the antics he got up to. The suffix log added to this word signals the type of discourse or genre of writing that will follow this heading. We know what kind of discourse to expect when we're reading a travel log or a catalogue, or what form a speech might take if it's a monologue, like this one. By calling his spam and processed food poems monologues, then Perez signals to his readers that the following writing falls into his own genre, typified by humor and playfulness. Perez also calls Juan Malo a resistance figure, so you can also expect that these poems are resistance poems that in this case push back empire. So in other words, Perez transports the resistance genre of Juan Malo's stories from the Spanish colonial period to Guam's current period of US military occupation. In this particular poem, Perez uses spam to directly engage with racist stereotypes of Pacific Islanders by including the epigraph from Paul Thoreau's The Happy Isles of Oceania. So as you can see in this quotation, Thoreau theorizes that Pacific Islanders love spam because it came the nearest to approximating the porky taste of human flesh. Thoreau applies his racist cannibal reference liberally, not specifically, across all Indigenous peoples of Oceania. And while the rest of the poem focuses on spam and Guahan in particular, Perez's inclusion of this quotation highlights forced links between these peoples through imperialism in the context of foodways, in the sense that colonialism has exploited the environments of numerous Pacific islands, and due to the ways colonial powers have stereotyped people from Oceania. Perez's first line in this poem asserts that Guam is considered the spam capital of the world due to its per capita rate of consumption. It is a culinary legacy directly linked to US war victories, and also a legacy that is replicated in, as Perez says, all places with a history of US military presence. Not only that, but Perez envisions its role in future wars as well, and uses spam to emphasize the links between capitalism and militarism in the region. The image of a car dealer giving away rice and spam with every purchase. The food the car dealer offers for free is processed and nutritionally deficient, as are the 40,000 cases of spam that Hormel donates to Guahan following a typhoon. The end result of so much spam can be found in our newspaper's obituary pages. Perez writes to end the poem, tracing here a direct line from militarism, capitalism, and misguided aid in Oceania to Chamorro deaths. The square brackets around our in the final line signals that he is talking specifically about Chamorro deaths. Throughout his series, he uses square brackets around collective nouns such as we and our often in order, in many ways, it prevents readers from interpreting that collective as a universal plural pronoun. In this particular case, emphasizes that the fatal military legacy embodied in and accumulating through spam specifically impacts Chamorro populations, and read in combination with the opening quotation, populations of Indigenous peoples across Oceania. By beginning with the quotation from Thoreau, this monologue signals that the kind of overt racism it expresses is not confined to the past. And the final line of the poem confirms that this legacy is replicated through other connected acts of racism and colonialism in the Pacific today, systematized and legitimated through language that enables military actions and misguided aid from international organizations. So in the same way that the personification of the US empire, Uncle Sam, carries with it connotations of kinship and supposed benevolence, Perez's pun on this personification, Uncle Spam, is not only funny from the earlier poem, but also conveys some of the complex and insidious ways that spam, along with empire, has entwined its way into Pacific genealogies and histories, including family histories. In a different processed meat poem focused on corned beef hash, Perez includes an epigraph from a poem by Kanaka Maoli author Brandy Nalani McDougall that states, from uncle, no matter which uncle, you eat whatever uncle brings. Using the term uncle frames the US empire as kin, materialized and made consumable as Uncle Spam, empire becomes, as Perez puts it, part of a, quote, digestional genealogy, a delicious cycle embedded in the lives of Chamorro people. It enforced its kinship and coerced consent. As such, Perez portrays empire as feeding its way into the very cells and relationships of his own family. Not only that, but the cycle is also bound up in the labor of other marginalized peoples, such as undocumented migrants working at spam factories. Chamorro peoples and undocumented migrants are both exploited by and co-opted into the violence of the US empire. Chamorro youth through the military, and the migrants, who often are also Micronesians, through also being forced from their homelands and now working at the spam factories in horrific conditions. Perez does not suggest that these conditions are an anomaly, but a part of wider patterns of US capitalism and imperialism. As he points out in I Eat, Therefore I Spam, he says, quote, spam is so cheap because their lives are worth nothing to Hormel, because our lives are worth nothing to Hormel. The effects of these patterns may at first seem separate from the speaker's life. They affect their lives, but the rapid shift to how they affect our lives emphasizes the cumulative, interconnected nature of this kind of exploitation. Perez later describes a pair of vegan Chamorros living in diaspora in Minnesota who, missing spam, tried to create the perfect vegan version of it. But, quote, I will never eat it, he says. The perfect spam cannot exist, he implies, because the imperial structures of its creation and distribution, bearing what he calls the global burden of disease, remain. The structures of empire forces Chamorro diaspora in the US, including contributing to the vegans' exile in Minnesota, and so empire followed them there too, just like spam did. So as Perez asserts through his poetry, spam is not only the most trans-Pacific of foods, but also the most military and the most imperial. Paloma Fresno Caleja calls the foodways of US imperialism gastro-colonialism and argues, quote, that the contemporary foodways in the Pacific, including spam, are not only a side effect of colonization, militarization, or neo-imperialism, they also contribute to feed these processes and the discourses that sustain them, end quote. So directly engaging with this concept of gastro-colonialism, Perez, writing again for Kenyan Review, states that spam is now a part of our cultural diet and inheritance, because its insidious power is tied to the ways it has been inserted and entwined itself into Pacific genealogies, childhoods, and memory. The way spam distorts foodways in the Pacific might be thought of in much the same way as we might think about the ecology on a palm oil plantation, or like the decimated ecologies in Guahan that Perez describes throughout his books, resulting from the invasion of brown tree snakes transported via military aircraft or ships, and subsequently driving native bird life to extinction. These ecologies contain life, but at the expense of pre-existing biodiversity, and they are dependent on the structures of capitalism and imperialism to sustain their trans-Pacific dominance. So spam for Perez makes visible the US's vast trans-Pacific military reach and its impact for Indigenous peoples from Oceania, especially those from Guam. He maps out the ecologies of spam in the Pacific characterized by invasion, erasure, and a monopoly within foodways for Indigenous peoples. In other poems, Perez foregrounds these structures to the ways that spam distorts, obliterates, and or exploits the norms of consumption, and links them to the ways that militarization and capitalism exploit environmental norms. And we might also think of this, of course, like the textual internet media form of spam, and how that exploits and influences norms of communication and meaning. By asking us to look at the gastro-colonial discourses underpinning the dissemination and circulation of spam as military and capitalist forces, Perez critiques the kind of globalism inherent in, for example, corporate or Disney-fied images of Oceania, such as Moana, that flatten out what he portrays elsewhere as an Indigenous ocean of stories engaged in diverse sovereign struggles on multiple planes. So in summary, I read his writing about spam as part of wider Indigenous efforts to demilitarize the ocean, using his poetics as a vehicle to remap colonial understandings of the Pacific and its Indigenous peoples. So thank you very much. I'll take your questions. And this photo is from our visit to the spam museum with my long-suffering companions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Bonnie. So I think that since we have a smaller group today, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask any questions you have.
That was a great talk. I'm sorry I have to run, but that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
So maybe I can ask maybe the most obvious question, I suppose, right? But is there anything that we can do to try to change this narrative a little bit? Because it is, I guess I'll never look at SpongeBob and spam the same way again, right? This is quite interesting to find out. So is there anything that we can do to kind of help the efforts and kind of change this?
Yeah, that's a really big question. And I think it definitely depends on your own positionality and where you're coming from, and what kinds of communities you're a part of. And for me, it's really all about pushing back against certain narratives and doing that by the things I choose to read or consume through media, and the things I write about, and for someone else it could be something that looks quite different. For Craig, for example, writing poems, but don't want to speak for anyone else. I just thought of one example. So I've spoken on spam before, and I did mention Moana in that talk too, and someone in the room asked, well, should I tell my niece who loves Moana not to watch Moana? And I'm like, no, let your niece watch Moana or SpongeBob or whatever, but don't let that be the only images of Oceania that they're consuming. Don't let that be the only narrative that they're hearing. Otherwise, that's the only thing they'll see about Oceania. Like if the only things people in these 48 states of the US are seeing about Hawaii, for example, is about this place to visit as a tourist, that's all they're going to see it as. So pushing back against narratives in that way, even when it's what your niece may consume as well. Thank you for that question. I might have to cook up some spam tonight.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I was born in Malaysia, and we actually eat a lot of spam as well. We typically cut them up and like kind of fry them in rice. So that's
Yes.
yeah, it's actually really nice, really tasty.
Delicious.
But
Yeah, no, I definitely still eat it and then try to critique it at the same time. It's a difficult, I mean, I think as Perez shows in his poems, there's multiple layers of difficulty in unentangling oneself from spam. Just like there's
yeah,
multiple layers of difficulty in unentangling oneself from US empire. Like we're all participating in the US colonial project right now. If we're living in the US, we're on Indigenous lands. So there's that difficulty too.
all right.
Sorry, I was just going to ask who all is here because there's names I don't recognize and it is a smaller group. So perhaps I can just ask people what departments they're coming from. If they're brave enough for that. No worries if not.
I guess I'm here from chemistry. From the abstract, I actually expected you to talk more about Hawaii. I've worked on both Hawaii and Guam. So that's kind of why I thought I'd come and listen to this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes, probably could have been more specific about Guam in the abstract. You're right.
Well, I mean, it was an unexpected surprise. It's been years since I've been there, so it was interesting.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming.
I'm in chemical engineering. I have absolutely zero connection to spam or Hawaii or Oceania. I'm from Switzerland. I'm from Switzerland originally. So yeah, I'm just learning something. I didn't come with many expectations except to learn something new, and that I did. So thanks a lot for the talk and the insight.
Thank you for coming. I think this makes the most chemical related people I've ever had ever in a talk. So I'm sure I'll learn something from you all too.
Hi, I'm actually from the astrophysics department. At the same time, I'm working in sustainability in university housing, and that's why I came to this talk. I think it was really interesting. While you were speaking, I was actually wondering if this mechanism of colonization using food or this kind of mechanism is connected with a bit with what Coca-Cola is actually doing in a lot of parts of the world, because that's the famous case, right? I didn't know anything about spam. I've never seen it. I've never tried it. So that's very far away from my knowledge. But I think that the example of Coca-Cola is very, very famous on the other hand.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic example. You probably have more knowledge of this than I do, but I have done a bit of reading about it in Central America, and I would say it's very similar. And I'm also thinking of the food boxes that were sent out, I think still are, to Native Americans in the lower 48, and how how that also facilitated ongoing colonial oppression. I think it's a pattern. The thing of colonialism, it's got diverse patterns, but also just repeats itself again and again and again. So you see these things popping up in all different contexts, but essentially echoes of the same. Like in New Zealand, for example, we had the same food rationing boxes sent out to Indigenous Maori communities, and very nutritionally deficient. And then those same food products take on this air of nostalgia later, even though they're essentially forced on people. So it becomes that very complex thing to disengage from. And I'm super interested in your astrophysics. That made me think of an incredible scholar from Oceania, from Pompeii, Vince Diaz, who's at the University of Minnesota, and he's doing some really cool things with Micronesian and Dakota star mapping and canoe navigation at the moment. So that's my only connection to astrophysics, and now I've used it up. I don't even know astrophysics, but you know, it has astro in it. Yeah.
Thank you. I actually find it very interesting, your approach, putting the literature point of view in that. It was really interesting. Thank you for that.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. I unfortunately don't have any chemistry related connections, unless you're thinking about the makeup of spam. We could, but who really knows? Yeah, that's definitely the most amount of scientists I've ever had. We briefly had a Colin, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to use these seminars as a way to kind of link a little bit more, because I think it has been predominantly very science heavy. So I'm kind of trying to link a little bit more with the arts as well.
Yeah, well, for everyone here, the project I'm part of here at CU Boulder is explicitly trying to bring the arts and sciences together through our Environmental Futures project, and it's a 2-year Mellon Sawyer seminar, and some of you may have students as well that could be interested in being a part of that, as we have a graduate seminar. So there's my little advertisement for Environmental Futures.
Do you have a link? I'm curious about this seminar. That you could share in the chat or so?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So your question was about showing a little bit more about the seminar, correct?
Yeah.
Cool. Yes. So throughout the year, we're bringing in speakers, including Craig here, who's already spoken back in November. And we're bringing in speakers. It's all on Zoom because of the pandemic. It was supposed to be in person, and all speaking about different aspects of environmental futures, taking the theme in different directions. So we've had literature people speak, but we've had ecologists speak. I'm going to forget things, our media people. So like Susan Shupley, for example, who talked about how materials themselves witness environmental degradation, and how do we represent those, for example, in the form of a documentary. Next week is we're going to hear from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a botanist, and she is from she's a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, and she's going to talk to us about her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which has got some, it's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. But basically she'll be talking to us about the teachings of plants. So we are bringing people with a more science bent as well as a more humanities bent, and kind of just seeing where it goes. And alongside that, we have the graduate seminar where we have readings every week, and the students are putting together various projects that we will put on our website, all speaking to this theme. And the idea is to kind of think about what is visible when we're talking about the environment and environmental destruction, our current moment of climate change, and what's invisible, and how do we maybe make the invisible things visible, or why are they invisible? And what can that mean as we think about solutions for our current problems? So we also, right in the beginning, we had 2 speakers who spoke about fire, for example, and different approaches to fire management, which of course was very pertinent at the time because we were experiencing those massive, the Cameron Peak fire, and the names of the fires I've forgotten already because there's so many. So that kind of thing. It's a very diverse mixture of topics, and it's continuing next semester, and there'll be more speakers next semester, such as Macarena Gomez Barras and Kim Tallbear, and many others.
This sounds super interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I think Theodore, you might have had something, or I'm sorry if I misheard.
I was just looking if we wanted to kind of get a discussion going. So I have kind of rather limited experience with the Pacific, but I guess I have some. And my impression is that even though these are very multicultural places, there's kind of a fusion culture, and there's spam and these other products of empire. And there seems to be this kind of perspective that, I mean, it's undeniable that they are products of empire, but as you said, like they can be kind of great points of nostalgia as well. So kind of looking toward the future, should we think of them as kind of almost irredeemable, at some time in the distant future they would be kind of not forgotten, but pulled away as kind of a process of decolonization? Or where is this going, I guess, is kind of what I'm wondering.
Thanks for that question. It's a great one. I honestly, it's probably, I would say it's up to the communities or individuals within the communities themselves how they approach that. For me, as a non-Indigenous person, as a settler in New Zealand, as an uninvited person in the United States, and then is also uninvited in West Papua, but who very much wants to be an ally towards sovereignty movements. For me, it's very, in my case, I need to pay attention to the history of spam and try to tell other people about that history. And I think Indigenous communities themselves will make those decisions for themselves. But for me, I will continue my critique of spam, and many authors can continue their critique of spam. I recently read, the name is going to escape me in the Zoom meeting, but if anyone wants to know later, I'll send you the name. But there's a Filipino author who I met recently in Colorado, and he's got a few spam poems too. So, yeah, it's up to people themselves to decide, but it would be really interesting to see where that goes. And that goes for sovereignty movements as well. There's very diverse histories of colonization in the Pacific, and therefore the movements for sovereignty and what that might look like for different people is also very diverse. But it also has some really interesting connections with people working together, knowing that they might have outcomes that might look different, or knowing that the different process, maybe we're not thinking about outcomes so much, but as processes of sovereignty, they can look different in different places, but we can also support each other's efforts in those areas. Yeah, I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but that's where my thinking's going when you asked it.
Yeah, I think that essentially answers it. Especially that last part about kind of more process than goal or end.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of your everyone's questions here, and especially, as I said at the beginning, I know everyone's tired of this. I know I am. So I really appreciate your coming, especially for those of you where it's a subject quite far from your own. And I hope to attend some of the others in the future and learn more about chemistry and astrophysics.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Can we all give Bonnie a round of virtual applause? I know it's not quite the same as being in person, but we'll just do our best.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. And so if you are interested in our next talk, we're going to invite Dr. Sarah Fisher and Carlos Pinedo, who are both from different engineering departments, and they're going to be talking about creating STEM community, and basically talk about the work of CEO organizations that support diverse grad students and postdocs. This will be next year in January. Can't believe it's the end of the year already, but there we are. So if you're interested in getting reminders and things like that and finding out more about these, please feel free to log on to our PAC website, and we'll share more information through that. Cool. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks, Jan.